Hello, everyone. So glad you can all join me for today's Portscast. We're going to be experiencing the art and architecture of Hearst Castle. My name is Elaine. I'm a guide one here, and we're going to talk more about Mr. Hurst, the building, the art, and hopefully it will inspire you to come visit us in real life. We are in San Simeon, in between Sacramento and LA. We are also part of the state park system. I know some of you guys have seen this badge before. It's got a bear there, and it says since 1864. That's when the state park system was put together to preserve all the beautiful land here in California, along with cultural sites and historical sites, just like this building behind me, Hearst Castle. That way you can visit it decades and decades from now, and it will still be as beautiful as it is today. Now, before this became a historical monument and a museum, it was William Randolph Hearst's vacation home, and he grew up on this land. So when he was about 3 years old, his dad, George Hurst, bought the first 40,000 acres here for roughly about 75 cents an acre. And George Hurst was originally a farmer from Missouri, and he came out here during the gold rush, as everybody was, and he found some gold, but he didn't get rich off of it. What he really got rich from was actually silver, the largest vein of silver in the Sierra Nevada as part of the Ophir mine, and he instantly became one of the wealthiest men in America. There's a shot of George Hurst there. And then he briefly went back to Missouri and married his wife, Phoebe Hurst. And they had one son, William Randolph Hearst. Now, William Randolph Hearst was not into mining. He is actually known better as America's first media mogul. Media mogul today would be somebody like Oprah, who has her hands in all types of media like TV, radio, movies, newspapers, the internet. When Mr. Hearst first started out, it was newspapers. Newspapers were the big deal. Later on, he would get into radio and movies, but newspapers was the first thing he got into. He got his first newspaper from his dad, the San Francisco Examiner. Now, I want you guys to imagine yourself being somebody during Mr. Hearst's time, and you want to know about the news, and you look across the street and you see a newspaper stand. I want you guys to think about, what newspaper would you pick up? Would you pick up newspaper number one, the Evening Times Republican? Or would you pick up newspaper number two, the New York Journal? Now, if looking back on either of these, you were saying absolutely number two, and you're not on your own there. Everybody really liked Mr. Hearst's newspapers because he kind of added some excitement to it. Prior to Mr. Hearst, most newspapers look like this. Nothing wrong with that. Long columns of kind of text. It's hard to see though. And it's just very much kind of bland, boring even. But Mr. Hearst, he popularizes the big splashy headlines, putting pictures in the front. He hires illustrators to draw pictures. And he's using very exciting copy. In fact, he was accused of, this is when yellow journalism came out, and he would exaggerate stories. But people loved his newspapers because it was exciting. It was kind of entertainment in a way. He popularized newspaper comics. And from there, he went on to have 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, 8 radio stations. Then he produced his movies with Cosmopolitan Pictures, and he became a media mogul. But here on the hilltop, it's less about what he does for a living and more about what he loves. And we are literally surrounded by it, the art, the architecture. But very initially, this is what he falls in love with, that view. Again, he's had that view since he was 3 years old. Dad bought the first 40,000 acres here, like I said, 75 cents an acre, and they used to call it Camp Hill. This is what it used to look like when Mr. Hearst would go camping here. They would set up tents and they would camp here. And he fell in love with the place. Always wanted to build something up here, but he couldn't do it for a really, really long time. And that's because when his dad, George Hurst, dies, all the fortune should have went to him. He was roughly around 28 years old when his dad died, and he is the only son. That was the tradition, was it should go to the firstborn son. Except George Hearst Buck's tradition gives it all to his mom, Phoebe Hearst. And one of the reasons was they believed that if they had given it to their son, who they had nicknamed Wasteful Willie, that he would squander the fortune. Mom never lets him build up here because mom believes that he would get carried away. You know, that I guess she knew her son. It was foreshadowing in a way. If you think Mr. Hearst could have gone bigger, you can go ahead and give me a thumbs up. You probably have William Randolph Hearst energy. But she thought he was going to get carried away, and he actually doesn't get to build here until she passes away and he inherits the land. By this time, he is 56 years old, waits around 3 weeks to start calling Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was an architect, and he said, I am really tired of camping in tents here. I want to build some bungalows. And it would take about 2 years. And instead, it took 28 years. And we'll get more into why it took that long. But to choose a female architect at the time was very progressive of Mr. Hearst. Julia Morgan is an impressive lady. She was the first licensed female architect in California. Actually, Julia Morgan was the first woman to be accepted into the Paris School of Fine Arts in the architectural program before she became the first licensed female architect in California. Now, Mr. Hearst knew she was smart and she was capable. And in her long career, she designs over 700 buildings here in California. Hearst Castle was project 503. And this was a side job for her. She would do it over the weekend because, again, Mr. Hearst said it would only take 2 years. How significant this is as far as Julia Morgan is concerned. In 1920, when she starts working with Mr. Hearst, Julia Morgan was 48 years old. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 16.5% of women in Julia Morgan's age groups were employed at that time. Educated women usually got into nursing, teaching, and clerical work, common professions for women at the time. But Julia Morgan was in a small group of female architects in the United States and received her certificate in 1902 and to go ahead and become the first licensed female architect in California. So when she starts building here, Mr. Hearst's idea of a bungalow quickly turned into something else. He wanted something called a Mediterranean revival style. So this is a romantic interpretation of 16th, 17th century Italian and Spanish architecture. In fact, he ended up wanting to have his own little Mediterranean village. And a revival, basically, he is kind of looking to have his own Mediterranean village of the 16th, 17th century. But one of the things that, I'll be right quick, share. It's a podcast for everybody, yeah. So one of the things that Mr. Hearst didn't have that's Italian or Spanish are Sekhmet. These are the oldest pieces here on the hilltop. Sekhmet is a fierce, bloodthirsty protector of the sun god Ra. She is half woman, half beast. She is the giver and taker of life. These pieces are the oldest pieces here on the hilltop, and these are roughly around 3,000 to 3,500 years old. And this is made out of diorite, which is a really hard granite-like rock. And Mr. Hearst obtained this because he kind of fell into a trend that was happening back then, and that was finding King Tut's tomb in the 1920s. So Egyptian artifacts, Egyptian culture really influenced the nation, and it influenced advertising like this. It influenced fashion, and it influenced the art world. Also, Mr. Hearst's mom got into it. She actually funded a lot of archaeological digs. Look at what Sekhmet's looking at. Amazing place to put it. So William Randolph Hearst's mom, Phoebe Hearst, is really the reason why Mr. Hearst loves art so much. When he was about 10 years old, Phoebe Hearst takes him on a grand tour of Europe, essentially a vacation that lasts a year and a half. In that year and a half, they're looking at museums in England. They're looking at castles in Ireland. They are looking at paintings and sculptures, Italy and Spain. By the time they get to Paris, he asks his mom, "Can we buy the Louvre Museum?" This is the Louvre Museum right here. Mom turned him down, but that gets his art fever going. He starts collecting art at the age of 10. He starts collecting marbles and ancient glass. And that collection kind of goes on as he starts building here on the hilltop. So a lot of the art pieces that you see here, he is obtaining as he's building. Because remember, he has a theme. And again, it's that Mediterranean revival style. And just here on the hilltop alone, there are 20,000 art pieces. 95 railroad cars filled with arts and antiques came here between the 20s and 30s, and this was only 10% of his collection at the time. In 1927, he already started having this idea that this was going to be more than just his house. This was going to be a museum. He wrote to Julia Morgan and said, "I can't see why San Simeon can't be a museum of the finest things I can acquire." Not only did he have a deep love of art, but he wanted to make sure that people who couldn't afford to go to Europe and enjoy this will still be able to see the artwork. And that's really one of the big reasons that he started to collect. Julia Morgan wrote to art dealers Arthur Bine and said, "I don't see myself where we are ever going to use half, as far as the art goes, half suitably. But I find that the idea is to try things out. And if they're not satisfactory, discard them for the next thing that comes." Now let's go back to this Mediterranean village he is creating here. So he starts out, remember, bungalows, but he ends up with not just one house here, but now there's here up top. We are looking at the largest guest cottage here, Casa del Mar. It's over 5,000 square feet with 18 rooms on 3 levels. And he names the cottages after the view. Casa del Mar, House of the Sea. Later on, we're going to see Casa del Sol. See a little bit of the rooftop there. And then Casa del Monte, House of the Mountain. And the little Mediterranean village would have a roadway. So here's the roadway, and that is an esplanade. So the esplanade is a road around. By the way, some parts here I might glitch out or pause or freeze. Just hang tight. Usually I can jump right back on. But this is the esplanade. This is where you're going to walk around the village. And any good Mediterranean village is surrounded by a church or cathedral. And that's what Hearst Castle is. Now, he is drawing inspiration from his travels with his mom, but he is also looking at books. So Mr. Hearst used to buy 2 books. He would buy a book for him, and he would buy a book for Julia Morgan. One of these books was the Minor Ecclesiastical. And they're looking at this book, like I said, for inspiration. One of the inspirations for the hill or for Casa Grande was a church from Ronda, Spain. And that church, let me show you guys. So this is the book that they're looking at. And the towers was inspired by this, a church in Ronda, Spain. That tower or that church only has 1 tower. Mr. Hearst and Julia Morgan, they're a big fan of symmetry. So he's going to have 2 towers. And one of the reasons it takes 28 years was because Mr. Hearst was constantly changing his mind. Let me give you an example of how he changes his mind about Casa Grande, the only house named after its size. So originally this was supposed to be 2 floors. So right about here. And then he changes his mind. He's like, "I want another floor." adds a third floor. And later on, this is going to be his private suite, the Gothic suite. And this is his bedroom, right? Well, nope, this is his bedroom right here. And he's going to have his office and library and everything here. Then he decides, yeah, I'm going to add another floor, also known as the Celestial Suites. As he adds another floor, he goes, the towers look small now. Let's go ahead and raise the towers. And when he raises the towers, he puts 18 bells in each tower. So 36 bells total, 137 feet up in the air. And underneath those bells, 2,500 gallons of water. That provides water for the castle. It is gravity powered. We still get our water from Pine Mountain. And Pine Mountain is a higher elevation than us. It's all kind of a gravity powered way to get all of this water up here. It starts from higher elevation, goes down a little bit lower than us, and flows right back up. It's called the gravity flow system. So Julia Morgan is not only having to deal with the art and having to deal with Mr. Hurst's visions, but she is also thinking about what she is going to build up here that will not only hold up, but also have, lots of freedom with artistic rendering, because he, again, is copying the look of a church, of a Mediterranean village. So she wants to build out of concrete up here for many, many reasons. One of the reasons, a big reason to build out of concrete, is something that happens in California, which I hope my acting skills can show you why I'm doing this. If you're thinking either she is having a moment or she's talking about an earthquake, I'm talking about an earthquake. Thank you, thank you. She wants to make this resistant and fire resistant for many reasons. But one of the reasons that happened, and it affected everybody, was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, essentially flattened the city. And that was because not a lot of people were working with steel reinforced concrete. Julia Morgan knows about steel reinforced concrete. She went to Paris to learn about it. And one of the remaining buildings after the San Francisco earthquake, which was 7.8 on the Richter scale, and a bigger one in 1989, was the bell towers in Mills College, because Julia Morgan builds out of steel reinforced concrete. Now, how does that work? Well, steel reinforced concrete has steel in it. So concrete, very strong once it dries. And then you add the rebar to it. And now there's some movement. It can kind of move side to side in case an earthquake happens. So it makes it really, really strong. We had an earthquake here in 2003, 6.5 on the Richter scale, and there's still no structural damage to Casa Grande or any of the guest cottages. It exceeds California code and regulations to this day. So Julia Morgan, she knew what she was doing. But let's look at the other inspiration that creates the castle, which, by the way, Mr. Hurst doesn't call it a castle, doesn't call it a church. He calls it the ranch. He calls this Casa Grande, the big house. The front of this is inspired by many different things. If you guys check out that teakwood cornice up there, that is teakwood from Thailand. It's carved by a man named Jules Supo. And Mr. Hurst saw a building in Sanguises, Spain with that cornice. And he's like, I like it. Let's make it. So if Mr. Hurst can't actually get the original, he's going to have it made. And this is a good example of that, is the entrance of Casa Grande. The entrance of Casa Grande is a mix of old and new. And using that concrete really helps, because he could recreate and put it, basically make molds of these architectural buildings that he's seeing in different places. For example, the front of Casa Grande was inspired by an alcazar, or a fortified palace in Seville, Spain. But his art collection is also integrated. So for example, the very top there is a 13th century Madonna and Child. She's made out of limestone. And originally they thought she was colored because they saw flecks of paint on her robe. And then if you go down a little bit more, we have some visitors here. You will see the hair this century. See cathedral or now check that entrance. This is the front door. The bottom half of that is 6th century Spanish gate. The upper half of that was done by Ed Stringler. Did a lot of the work here. So it is really a composite of old and new. So Mr. Hurst, he's incorporate a lot of the art that he's building up here. Also, you're going to see a lot of symmetry. Julia Morgan is working with something called a Beaux Art style, very decorative, very ornate, lots of symmetry. So symmetry is balance and proportion. Let's guys take a look at something that's asymmetric, doesn't really have balance or proportion. So you see one side is very different from another, and if you fold it in half, it's not going to match up. If you look at the symmetrical side, you'll see there's balance, proportion. If you fold it in half, it's going to match up. It mirrors each other. And if you guys look at Hearst Castle and you print that out on a piece of paper and fold it in half, it's going to match up. So yeah, balance and proportion. So we'll look at the main plaza here. 28 years I had told you that Mr. Hurst is building up here, and he never finishes. And Miss Julia Morgan said, you know, again, changeableness of mind. So during Mr. Hurst's time, if you were coming up here as a guest, this is where you were being dropped off on the south, we like to call the South Earring Terrace. Beautiful place to be dropped off, right? Got the ocean out there, but that's initially not what he wanted. He wanted to get outside. It's a beautiful view of the mountains, but it never got done. This is what the north side looks like right now. So it's kind of plain. It still has concrete. Plans for that would probably be have a fountain here, statues of the goddess Diana, which did make it, but they were never installed. And they're now at the Forest Lawn Cemetery down in Los Angeles. Julia Morgan said if, you know, the entrance had something called saisissant, which is striking. That's your new word for today. That's going to be your fancy pants word of the day. Try to work that into your conversation today. Say something is very striking. Saisissant. And this is going to be you. When you use a fancy word that you just learned 30 seconds ago, you can tell everybody, good day, peasants. But Casa Grande, eventually, around 1923 or so, it was finished, and they were using Casa Grande for many different things. So let's go inside and see what they were using it for. As I walk around the corner, by the way, service, a big difference between that building and the main building. This is the finished version, concrete with a limestone base. So a little block actually sold, and then that beautiful corner by Subo. And then if you finish, it's just going to be kind of plain concrete, doesn't have that teakwood cornice. Now, this is not going to, if during time, this would be the entrance that we're using today. Because if we go through the front entrance, there is ancient Roman tile on the other side of that entrance. So we don't want to walk on that ancient Roman tile. It's about the time I'm going to glitch out. So let me walk to a certain place here where we get a better connection. All right. So as you can see, we are decorated for Christmas. We decorate exactly as Mr. Hurst decorates during that time. So this is kind of a snapshot of the 30s. He has this large 18-foot tree here. There's a tree on the other side. We'll just wait until the tour moves on and I'll show you the assembly room. And one of the things that we like to do here is to be historically accurate. So when we are putting up the Christmas trees, we are looking at pictures from back in the day of how they decorated. So this is technically, like I said, a snapshot of the past. We are in the assembly room. So the assembly room is the living room of Casa Grande. And we are surrounded by Mr. Hearst art. And now, mind you, the art also includes the ceiling. So the ceiling here is 16th century Italian. The original ceiling was a little too short for the room. The room is 83 feet long. So Julia Morgan hires craftsmen and they create the rest of these panels out of cast plaster, molded and painted to look like wood. And these tapestries influenced the size of this room. Originally was going to be 73 feet long. But when Mr. Hurst obtains these 16th century Flemish tapestries, he didn't want it to crowd next to the fireplace. And so he said, let's extend the room. This is probably one of the only times that that's going to happen. Most of the time, they are modifying the art to fit the room and not the other way around. This room is modified to fit these 16th century tapestries. These tapestries are part of what's called the Deeds of Scipio. Scipio and the Second Punic War, where he defeats Hannibal. And Mr. Hurst obtains a lot of this art through art auctions. I'm going to show you guys the rest of the room through here. So Mr. Hurst gets these from art auctions and he bids on these art pieces and he thinks this is the best way to get a deal. Now, one of the reasons he could obtain so much art was because after World War One, Europe needed to make money after the war. So they were dismantling a lot of their old buildings. In Spain, they were burning buildings to replace it with newer ones to modernize their country. And so selling these art pieces helped them obtain money. It also created jobs. And this was around the time a lot of wealthy Americans were obtaining a lot of art. So for Mr. Hurst, it's not just paintings and sculptures. It is paintings, it is sculptures, it is fireplaces, it is doors, it is tables, it is chairs, columns. So a lot of these things for Mr. Hurst is part of the collection. And when they talked about Mr. Hurst as a collector, they called him an accumulator because a lot of the collectors at that time would collect or obtain art by what their art dealers told them to buy. And usually it would be paintings and sculptures. Mr. Hurst, he is buying because he loves it and he's buying with themes in mind. So if he's looking at a catalog and he sees something 16th, 17th century Italian, he is going to buy that for this house. If he sees something more German, more medieval, he's going to buy it for his house in Wintun by Mount Shasta. He actually has an actual castle, St. Donat's, and that's where all his medieval armory is going to go. He's also got a house in New York, and he's buying for his house in New York as well. That was his permanent residence in Manhattan. So not only is he buying art for here, but he's buying art for his other places. He is definitely collecting more like a 16th century wealthy person, where they would not only collect all the different things, including, housewares and doors and tables and chairs, but this is how you were displaying it. This is how you were showing your wealth. You were putting your tapestries in your living room and you were basically living around it. So this particular fireplace, which is absolutely huge, you guys look at the tour guide there in comparison to the fireplace. This is a 16th century French mantelpiece. And it is absolutely huge. He got this from Charles T. Barney's estate. You can only imagine the visitors sitting in front of that huge fireplace with huge logs and probably warming up this room. But there's also the dining room. Remember, this was used as the dining room until the dining room was built. And here is the refectory. The refectory is basically a communal dining hall. Monasteries, this is where the monks would go eat. And Mr. Hurst, this is his dining room as well. And we kind of stepped back in time. We went from 16th century Renaissance in the assembly room to 15th century Gothic style. What constitutes as a Gothic style? Everything is very thin and narrow. There's a playing of light and shadows, something called a OG arch, which looks like praying hands. OG is kind of like a curve meeting another curve in a continuous S shape. And so when I give tours, when you go into the assembly room, when people go in the assembly room, they look this way and that way. When people go in the Gothic, they immediately look up. And that is kind of the style of Gothic. You want to look up. Everything is telling you to look up. Very thin and narrow OG arches. In fact, when people come in here, you would think that the ceiling is actually a lot higher than the floor, but the floor is actually wider than the ceiling is high. And again, it's that Gothic style. So Mr. Hurst is not just playing with 16th, 17th century Renaissance. He's also playing with different art styles. And that's how he's buying his art according to these art styles. And guests would also be here to eat during their vacation. And this is the only dining room in the hilltop. If you are assigned to a cottage, you are not eating in your room. There is no kitchen. There is no dining room in the cottage. This is where you're eating because Mr. Hurst saw this not as a hotel, but a ranch. This is where you're going to go to have all your meals. He uses not very fancy plates, paper napkins, and ketchup and mustard on the table, just like how it used to be when he would go camping. But you were still surrounded by his art. So, for example, if you look over here, you'll see we're surrounded by what's choir stalls. These choir stalls are 15th century Spanish. They're also called mercy seats. So you guys see the little tiny seat there. If you were part of the choir and your legs got tired, you could actually sit a little bit on that seat. Nobody would notice because you would be wearing long robes. Then you could actually pull it down and it would become a full bench. But you as a guest, you're not sitting on these choir stalls. You are sitting in the 17th century replica chairs. Yeah. He has more tapestries here. A lot of people ask about the flags. Originally, Mr. Hurst wanted to have stained glass windows, but then later on, he said it was too dark. So he decided to, or Julia Morgan actually, this was her idea to add paleo flags. Paleo flags are from the paleo races in Siena, Italy. Each district has their own flag. It's a horse race. You could actually look it up on YouTube. And whatever district wins, they display their flag for an entire year. This is the one that won in August, the one with the goose, red and green flag there. We do have a 16th century ceiling above us. Mr. Hurst still has the largest antique ceiling collection in America. So pretty impressive ranch. I don't know about you guys, but this doesn't look like a ranch to me. So the refectory is 68 feet long, 28 feet wide, 27 feet high, and 1,940 square feet. Casa Grande itself is 65,000 square feet, has 115 rooms, 38 bedrooms, and 42 bathrooms. Pretty large. So we're going to head on out and we're going to look at more of Mr. Hurst's little Mediterranean village. And then you guys could see the other side of the assembly room here. More of the 16th century Flemish tapestries. Now, as he's building here, remember he is married with 5 sons. And his 5 sons actually gave him the idea for probably one of the most iconic features here on the hilltop. And we'll get back to that. But we are now on the north side of the property with the beautiful view of the mountains. And You could see more of the Esplanade and his little Mediterranean village. We are now looking at the smallest guest cottage here, Casa del Monte, House of the Mountain, named after those mountains. 2,500 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms. You could fit that entire house in the assembly room of Casa Grande. I'm going to pause here really quick so you can look at that spectacular view of the mountains. At their height, the Hearst family owned 240,000 acres here in San Simeon. And to get the scope of how big that is, how much land they owned, guys, look at that tiny little mountain right there. The base of that mountain was the border of his land. That's 35 miles out. That's how much land he owns. The Hearst family owns still a little over 80,000 acres here on the hilltop, and it's still an actual working ranch. So when I talk about ranch, I'm talking about a working ranch as well during Mr. Hearst's time, because all their food was coming from the ranch for the most part. The fruit, the vegetables, the poultry, the beef, because this was in the middle of nowhere. Technically, it's still kind of the middle of nowhere. Now, as we walk along, another feature that makes this a Mediterranean village for the 16th, 17th century are these things. People ask me about this all the time when they visit. And these are sarcophaguses. You're going to see sarcophaguses as you walk along the esplanade. Sarcophagus literally means flesh-eating box. And during the time, usually they would be made out of lime. You'd put a body in there, it would decompose, wash it out, reuse it. Now, why would Mr. Hearst have sarcophaguses around his Mediterranean village? Well, in the 16th century, they reused sarcophaguses as planters and put them around their gardens. So that's what Mr. Hearst is doing here. This sarcophagus is 3rd century, made out of marble, and it shows the 9 muses, which are the daughters of Zeus, or Jupiter, if you're going by the Roman god. The male figure in the middle is Apollo, the god of the sun, music, and prophecy. On his right is Athena, goddess of wisdom and defensive warfare. The muses here are the personification of literary arts, music, science. Muses were an inspiration to musicians, writers, actors, artists, historians, and scientists. Actually, the words museum, music, musician, amusements come from the Greek word muse. This is a very interesting sarcophagus, by the way. I don't know if you guys can see this, but Apollo, if you look really carefully, notice how his head's just a little bit bigger than the rest. And it's kind of awkwardly put on there. And that was because when they built the sarcophagus, they did not carve Apollo's head yet. They actually carved the head after the person that's deceased was put in it. So they customized the sarcophagus. So that person that you were looking at, or that head, was who was deceased and buried in this particular sarcophagus. However, there's no bodies in the sarcophaguses now, so no need to worry. So this is the Mediterranean village, and usually outside of a Mediterranean village are the Roman ruins. We're walking by Casa del Sol, House of the Sun. This is the mid-sized cottage, over 3,000 square feet with 18 rooms, mid-size. Mr. Hurst's beautiful gardens. And originally, Mr. Hearst wanted a rose garden over here, and he wanted maybe a reflecting pond. But his 5 sons said, "Dad, this is our vacation home. It gets up to 115 degrees up here. We're going to need a pool." I'm paraphrasing. So he tells Julia Morgan, "If it seems practicable, can you please build a pool here temporarily, at least?" And I think we all know that that temporary part didn't stick. It actually became very permanent. So permanent, in fact, it's probably one of the most popular spots here, excuse me, on the hilltop. And that is the Neptune pool. So the Neptune pool still fits in with his Mediterranean village. This is the Roman ruins outside of the village. This is the third version of the pool. The second version, which was the first version, actually got pulled completely out. The second version of this pool is the inner oval that you see right there. We're going to get a little closer. And then, of course, the third version of the pool was put in around the 30s. And if you were a guest here, you could swim in this pool morning, noon, night, wintertime, fall, because this pool was heated. So again, all this amazing ancient artifacts, but very modern when it comes to your amenities. So heated pool, this part of it, it is 10 feet deep. That is the shallow end at 3.5 feet deep, holds 345,000 gallons. And of course, the pool's namesake right above us, there is Neptune. There he is. And the two sea nymphs next to him, roughly over 400 years old. And Neptune is made out of limestone, and the two sea nymphs next to him are made out of marble. And he used to have a trident, but then it got lost and it was never reattached. It was damaged in 1936 and it was sold to someone else. Something else that happened to Neptune is poor Neptune got his feet cut off. Remember I said Mr. Hurst modified the art to fit whatever his vision was. Neptune's feet had to be sacrificed in order for him to fit into that pediment. And then below that is columns of 2,000 years old. The rest of the statues that you see here, the swans and the nymphs, and of course, right over here in the alcove is the birth of Venus. There she is. This was carved by Charles Cousseau in the 1930s. So yeah, so he still made the pool work for himself to fit his theme of Mediterranean revival style. I'm going to ask a question that everybody asks, and I know some of you are already asking, does anybody get to swim in this pool? Yes, if you are a Hearst family member, you can swim in this pool. If you are part of the Hearst Foundation, which the Hearst Foundation does a lot of fundraising to help us with the restoration and the maintenance of the castle, you can swim in this pool for a price. We have 4 swims every year. And if you're part of the Hearst Foundation, you can buy tickets to swim in this pool for 2 hours for $1,500, give or take. So if you guys have $1,500, go ahead and buy me a ticket because I want to swim in this pool. And he also has an indoor Roman pool, which we won't have time to see today. Hopefully on another webinar, I can take you to there. The last time Mr. Hurst was here was 1947. He was having heart problems and he needed to be closer to the city. When he stayed here, it was just, in the very beginning, it was just a few months, then 3 months, and then 6 months. And according to his housekeeper, he was thinking about retiring here. And he actually tried to offer Casa del Monte, the smallest guest cottage, to a doctor so he could retire up here. But that never happened. And so he had to go down and be closer to the city, to be closer to doctors and hospitals. Because again, middle of nowhere, it's going to be hard for an ambulance to come up here. So as he's going down the hilltop, he taps his driver and tells his driver to stop and look back at his ranch because he knew that was probably going to be the last time that he was up here. And he, despite having 28 years of building, he told his son he was only 50% done with the place. So we can only imagine what Mr. Hurst and Miss Morgan would have built up here had they lived forever. I think they would have been very pleased to see how it turned out today, to see how their visions being appreciated and seen by people around the world. I want to go ahead and thank you guys for joining me today. I hope to see you up here in person someday. And don't forget, Hearst Castle has a Portscast every month. So keep an eye out for it when the dates are for that. And usually, if you join us on Facebook and Instagram, we usually announce maybe a week before when we have a Portscast. If you would like to know more information about Mr. Hurst, about the castle, about the workers here at the castle, give us a follow on YouTube for more videos. And you can get that at youtube.com/ at Hearst Castle San Simeon. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining me. Have a wonderful Christmas and happy holidays to all. I will see you all next year. Thanks so much. Bye.